Good afternoon. My name is Greg Wadley with CTC and Associates, and I'm the Clear Roads Administrator. We're here for the final webinar of the project, Integrating Advanced Technologies into Winter Operations Decisions. The research team from SRF here is being led by Chris Curd. Before I turn it over to him, I want to let you know that we are recording this webinar today, and it'll be posted on the Clear Roads website for you to view at your own convenience at a little bit later date, probably a little bit later this week. We'll also have everybody on mute today, so there's no background noise. However, if you have any comments or questions, please enter them into the chat box, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. I believe that's all the housekeeping items, so I'm going to turn it over to the research team from SRF. It's all yours.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Greg. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Curd with SRF. I'll be presenting the final presentation for this project, Integrating Advanced Technologies into Winter Operations Decisions, on behalf of SRF, along with Mark Gallagher, also on the research team. So let's go ahead and get started. So the goal of this project was to identify emerging technologies in winter maintenance and then their current fitness for deployment in winter maintenance applications. We also took a look at sort of a 5-year horizon for emerging technologies such as big data platforms, machine learning, CAV, 5G, all that good stuff that's coming out but not quite implemented yet. Try to get a feel of where it would be over the next 5 years. So this was a pretty exhaustive research project. Several tasks involved in this, started by doing a literature search, researching publications about existing pilot projects going on, sort of got a current state of the practice, and also looked for interesting pilot projects, emerging technologies, and how they're being used. Following that, we conducted a survey of many winter maintenance agencies. Most of you on the call probably got a copy of that survey and responded, so thank you for that. We asked several questions regarding what types of technologies you use in your winter maintenance fleet, along with any research projects you're doing and interest in pursuing future technologies as they continue to evolve. Following that, we identified some of the most interesting survey responses that we got and conducted follow-up interviews with 5 separate agencies, and we'll go into the details of those later in the presentation. We also did a survey and summary of current data analytics tools on the platform. This includes big data platforms and visualization programs, ways to present the data that's collected over winter maintenance activities. All this data was synthesized into a recommendations report that produced sort of the current state of the practice and recommendations for future deployments of these technologies that we analyzed over the course of this report. And all of this was summarized into a final report, which we are presenting to you today. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the project team. Greg Wadley did the introduction, project manager from the Clear Road side, and also the Project Technical Advisory Committee, Tom Peters from Minnesota, Scott Simons from Maryland, Todd Law from Vermont, John DeCastro from Connecticut, Melissa Longworth from Michigan, and John Fleming from Pennsylvania. And the consultant team is listed at the bottom as well. So sort of the key takeaways, executive summary of this report. What we found is that progress in developing these technologies used in winter maintenance has been more evolutionary rather than revolutionary. What this means is we're seeing incremental improvements on technologies such as pavement sensors, wireless communication, camera, video analytics, items like that, rather than this revolutionary next big technology that's ready to go right now. A lot of those emerging technologies like data analytics platforms, 5G connected and autonomous vehicles, those are still emerging, and any deployments of them today would be mostly experimental pilot projects. And we encourage you to pursue those pilot projects as opportunities arise. But right now, I think what we found is there's a lot of interesting things going on in a lot of different areas of winter maintenance, and it's just a lot of incremental change rather than one big game changer. So at this time, I'll toss it over to Mark Gallagher to talk a little bit about the literature review we did, allow him to introduce himself, and we'll go from there. Mark?
Hi, everyone. And before I get too far in, Chris or Greg, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you everyone for giving us the chance to talk with you today. Good morning and or afternoon, depending upon where in the country you happen to be sitting at the moment. I began this project at its inception, and unfortunately, I had a few things coming up with health reasons that took me out of the picture for a while, and Chris took over for me. So I'd extend a little bit of thanks to him as well. But one of the things that I worked on early on in the project was the literature review. And the literature review was a challenge for primarily the reason of how expansive it could be. In the early meetings and teleconferences for the project, one of the questions we wrestled with is, so when we talk about advanced technologies, what do we mean? How do we put bounds around what we are talking about? Next slide, please. The way we ended up approaching it was to divide the world into what we call knowledge domains. You could also just call it topics, categories, anything you want, but knowledge domains sounded nice and descriptive and really kind of official, and we liked how it sounded, so that's what we went with. In the end, we came up with 4 broad knowledge domains that we could organize our search around. You see those listed on the screen. Things that go on a vehicle, either the control system interaction, both the vehicle driving controls and spreader box plow control type things, and sensing systems. Most of you are of course familiar with pavement condition sensors, temp sensors, air sensors, things like that. Then we said, okay, beyond the vehicle, there are also things that one puts at the side of the road. Again, sensors for things like RLIS and items like that, but also the signal systems that exist out there, how they interact with winter maintenance vehicles, and in pavement sensors, stuff like that, as well as the pavement itself. Once we've got things out in the field, both on the vehicle and at the roadside, the question is, how do you move that data around? And that's where a lot of action is happening in the world right now, is we're generating these mountains of data. How do we get it to somewhere where it's going to be useful, both coming in to process it and get it back out? That, of course, encompasses a number of things. Most of you are going to be familiar with cellular communication. There's an emerging technology called low power wide area networking, which has some interesting implications for things like sensor systems. And we're seeing a lot of evolution in the satellite industry. Satellite, of course, has been around for a very long time. One of the projects I worked on in the late 90s actually was a winter maintenance satellite-based communication system. But again, as Chris notes, these things are evolving. And lastly, we're seeing interesting things emerging with back office systems. This is where you process, visualize, and use the data. So what we'll do is walk briefly through kind of the key findings in each of these areas, and then come back to a quick underview or key takeaway for the entire set of knowledge domains. And I'll throw it back to Chris. Next slide, please. A few quick notes about the lit search itself. We tried to be expansive. We've got about 108 sources cited in the report. We looked across as many domains as we could, both industry and academic, as well as looking at things that had been published on the public or governmental side. We looked both within the United States and at international sources. And if you go to look at the review summary that we produced, it's 26 pages long, so there's a fair amount of content there. Next slide, please. So let's talk quickly about the vehicle-based systems. We did a study with ClearRoads that wrapped up last year about on-vehicle mobile sensors, things like that. And this goes not only to the traditional pavement temperature, air temperature type things, but also friction, pavement condition, things like that. what we found and what continues to be reported is that sensor reliability, in other words, how good the data is you can get from these things, varies quite a bit based on both sensor type and by the manufacturer within a given sensor type. These sensors tend to be fairly expensive, but costs are falling, and at the same time, it appears that reliability is improving. So depending upon what you need to collect, these things can be very reliable, very usable. For other things, particularly such as doing a non-intrusive or non-contact friction sensing, they're much less reliable. So it's important to understand what you want to get out of these systems as you deploy them. Speaking of friction, there's also some interesting research out there right now doing tire-based friction sensors, which I think complements nicely the notion of that non-intrusive or non-contact sensors have some real issues with consistency and reliability, but there are some elements out there that move to a mobile but not separate from the vehicle. In other words, you don't need a separate friction trailer to judge friction as you move along. But as Chris noted, this is another one of these things that's still in the research stage. Moving beyond that, just into general vehicle operation, things like collision avoidance. We see a lot of that in passenger vehicles now, but for heavy vehicles, and particularly for things like dump trucks, winter maintenance vehicles, plow trucks, it's still really experimental. Even though one can easily get, a collision avoidance system in a new Camry, it is hard to find something that you can get on a new plow truck that does the same sort of function. But people are working with that now. Same thing with driver assistance, which is sort of a subset of collision avoidance and lane departure sort of things. Again, these are systems that have been researched and demonstrated, but there don't really appear to be much out there for commercial products, things that one can deploy in the next few years. Same thing with autonomous operation. We hear a lot in the news about particularly passenger vehicles now getting into long haul freight a little bit. The idea of a vehicle that can simply do its thing without a lot or any, in some cases, human interaction. There was a lot of talk about this from about 2016 to 2018, 2019. But since then, I think reality has started to set in a little bit, and most of the manufacturers, even on the passenger vehicle side, are backing away from some of their projections about the availability of full autonomy. And we're not seeing a lot that's going to be available. In other words, something you can deploy on the heavy vehicle or maintenance vehicle side within the next few years. We saw some interesting stuff with video monitoring. This is the idea of putting cameras on the vehicle to improve operator situational awareness. The technology here is improving quickly, particularly for things like lens cleaning, heated lenses, image stabilization, stuff like that. And not only are they getting better, they're becoming more and more widely used. So that's half a dozen quick points that we took from the vehicle-based systems out of the literature review. Next slide, please. On the roadside systems, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. As we note, sensors are improving, but particularly the non-intrusive ones, things that rely on reflected light or infrared reflectivity, things like that. They're getting better. The data they produce is improving in quality and consistency, but we're finding that they require maintenance. And whether or not that is ready for prime time is really going to depend a lot on the individual deployment, how far away things are, how able you are to address things like that. A few years ago, I worked with a company called Axelis that did a video processing artificial intelligence system to determine roadway conditions, both for fixed cameras and in some cases even moving cameras. This is kind of interesting because it gets at some of the questions of visibility and road cover for snow cover, things like that. These systems are now commercially available. Going back to 2015, 2016, they were largely demonstration phase things. There are now commercial products that one can buy and use, although they do tend to come with a pretty substantial cost. We've been looking at integration with traffic signals, and this is something that was looked at closely here in Minnesota along the Highway 55 corridor. This really is centered around the notion of providing priority for plow vehicles, both on main lines, so that you either get extended greens or early greens and extended greens to keep the vehicle moving, but also when you deal with top of on-ramp and off-ramp signals to be able to provide priority for the vehicle as they go up and down those ramps. That shows promise. It's been demonstrated in a few places with plow vehicles. It really comes out of the transit world with transit signal priority, so the underlying technology is fairly well developed, but it's really just now being looked at for maintenance operations. Interesting side note, the notion of heated pavement, it's actually improving. Energy costs, of course, remain very, very high, but given the trend towards not trying to melt snow cover, ice cover, but rather to just break the adhesion between that covering and the underlying pavement, there may be some applications where this actually makes sense. Again, the technology there is being researched. Its ability to be practical is improving, but you really need to have a reason to use it because it is expensive both to install and operate. We also looked at some drone systems out there, which are used fairly commonly for storm monitoring, but just by the nature of getting into the storm and the atmospheric conditions, primarily wind and some precipitation, you basically need a big drone. And that means an expensive drone, and that limits its practicality. So we're not sure we see a lot moving into the maintenance operations side for that. But it is interesting on the meteorology and forecasting side. Next slide, please. Communication system is probably where the most new technology is emerging now. Everybody, of course, has heard about 5G. God knows Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile will not let us go 5 minutes without seeing it on TV. And it will have several effects. It will improve bandwidth, the bits per second you can get through the system. But 5G is an interesting grab bag of technology. And to really see huge improvements in bandwidth, you need to use the very high frequency bands within 5G. Those do not propagate well and they don't penetrate well. So generally you'll see the greatest effects in high density areas, really downtowns where you have basically every block or every other block a microcell set up for 5G. So the relevance on particularly rural winter maintenance is a little questionable. On the other hand, it does provide improved channel availability, which is really how many simultaneous connections you can have on a tower. And in rural areas, the cell carriers don't like to admit this very much, but they do prioritize roaming travelers when they've got limited channel availability on towers, largely because then you can rack up roaming charges for people who still have that on their plans. Getting improved channel availability will likely improve accessibility for systems, particularly in rural areas. The other thing to be aware of is that the resources, the spectrum used for 2G and 3G cellular connections are being reallocated. They're very quickly going to 4G LTE to replace the 2G, 3G stuff and moved into 5G. So that will likely have implications for folks that have installed a lot of 3G cell modems, both on vehicles and for roadside systems. The interesting evolution of 5G, and Chris alluded to this earlier when he talked about 5G being experimental. The consumer cell side is fairly well established at this point, but the vehicle-to-vehicle, what they call the ad hoc peer-to-peer networking, is part of what's called 5G Release 16. And you may also run across the weird acronym CV2X, which is Connected Vehicle to Anything. That standard was actually just formalized and accepted earlier this year. So what we talk about with cooperative vehicle operations, trucks talking to cars, cars talking to trucks, both of them talking to roadside equipment, there aren't any 5G CV2X products out there now. So that's still largely a speculative and research area. Moving on from the cellular stuff, there is something really interesting called the LPWAN, which is low power wide area networking. And it's both very low power and low bandwidth, but because it is so low powered, it enables some really interesting installations with sensors. So if you've got smart systems that are able to wake themselves up, power up, take a reading, make a connection, and send your data, things like that now work over large areas with relatively modest installations for power supplies. And so that's worth thinking about in terms of data collection when you're doing roadside connections, things like that. Many of you may have also heard about things like Starlink or OneWeb, which are a new generation of low Earth orbit satellite systems. These are improving very quickly and their costs are dropping. This is something that'll be interesting for remote monitoring when you want to do higher bandwidth things. In other words, I want a camera installed in a remote location. I still want to be able to get data back from that. In the early days, there were low Earth orbit systems, but they tended to be very, very costly in terms of pennies per bit, or in some cases dollars per bit that you were trying to send through them. That made it impractical to do things like video. Or you had the geostationary systems, which also were expensive, but now came with the penalty of very long latency, which made them unsuitable for streaming applications and things like that. So the newer version, things like Starlink, again, lower cost, higher bandwidth, simpler installation, and it will be interesting to see how that evolves to allow you to do roadway condition and weather monitoring in much more remote locations. Next slide. And the last piece then is we're collecting all this great data from vehicles and at the roadside. We're now able to move it around. What is it that we are seeing with the back office systems? What's going on with data collection, processing, maintenance, distribution? There's some really interesting things going on out there with third-party data systems, both for the traffic side, where you get, for example, the INRIXs or HEREs, or the more connected vehicle-oriented WEJOs of the world. So you can get a lot better information about the performance of the roadway and how traffic is flowing by using these third-party services as opposed to deploying your own sensor networks. Along with that, consumer weather stations are now something you can access to supplement something like an RWIS network. There's a trade-off there, of course, because these are not professional industrial installations. You can have issues with data availability, you can have issues with sensor performance. However, with proper data management, you can start to fill in gaps. And particularly in cabin country, what we call it in Minnesota, where folks install these things at their lake places, you can start to get data on a larger and a more dense scale, which allows you, of course, to start doing more interesting things with your maintenance decisions and operations. Along with all of that new data, it's now possible to handle some very, very large data sets, what's commonly thrown around the term big data out there. And by very large data sets, we are talking about hundreds of billions or trillions of records that can be manipulated, moved from place to place, restored, backed up, operated upon, and maybe most importantly, on the next point, fed into artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. And those we're seeing out there in the literature, they both improve data analysis because they can work with large systems and they're very good at pattern recognition. But they also have the interesting effect of reducing biases. Once you set up classification schemes, whenever you've got kind of a qualitative analysis that you have to do, some of those outputs are going to be dependent upon the person doing the reviewing and classification. And machine learning systems have the potential to reduce some of those biases in systems and potentially give you better answers out of your data. And also, along with that, the ability to analyze more traditional sorts of data, things like idealized routing systems for vehicles, doing your material recommendations, doing travel time predictions. We're seeing these systems evolve and start to fulfill those kinds of functions out there. Next slide, please. There we go. So what does all this mean? Number one, I'd advise you to flip through the report. There's a lot of very detailed information in there that, for obvious reasons, we can't get into here. But what we find is that in all of the domains we looked at, we find technology is advancing. But as Chris notes, we find these advances are evolutionary, not revolutionary. Many of you have probably at least had passing contact with everything I've talked about here, but these are becoming better, cheaper, faster, easier to use. And that's important because evolutionary changes can cross a breakpoint. You reach a level of practicality that now enables you to do things. For example, I kept talking about remote sensor stations, things like that. Before, it may have been impractical just because of the data costs. You either had to build your own relay network or you were having these huge monthly costs to move data around. But now these things suddenly become practical just through an evolutionary change, and that allows you to start doing new things. And as a corollary to that, we're finding that these technologies complement existing practices, and they complement the systems you already use rather than replace or rather than totally revolutionize how you do things. So again, the theme we're coming away with from the literature is there's a lot going on, but everything is sort of inching forward across all of these domains. And so you can really use these things to complement what you do as opposed to revolutionize or change what you do. And since I've talked and talked and talked, I'll give it back to Chris.
All right, thank you, Mark. So after we completed that literature review, look into all those domains, technologies, we sent out a survey to all the ClearRoads members and got responses for that. We previously presented on this to the project team earlier in the committee, so go through a brief review of the survey results we got. So to discuss the methodology, we distributed the survey online via SurveyMonkey. I've sent the link out to the group provided to us by Greg and the ClearRoads team. We've received responses in July and August of 2019, and respondents included both public agencies at all levels. We got state, county, and local cities as well. And we also got private consultants and maintenance companies as well, responses from them. The survey questions that we asked include a variety of types of questions, including free form, rate from 1 to 5, free response, yes, no, questions like that. And we also implemented branching logic with the survey. So for instance, if agency reported that they used a particular technology, such as pavement sensors, the survey would then ask some follow-up questions: what type of sensors, what problems have you run into, etc. And overall, we received 40 valid survey responses, meaning that they were complete or complete enough where we had enough information to process it. We received 33 responses from 27 states. You can see the map there. Obviously, a good portion of the Midwest and Northeast, also some responses from the Northwest as well. We also got international responses as well from several European countries, Scandinavian countries, and also from Canada. So to summarize some of the more interesting survey responses that we found that sort of tie into what we've been talking about previously in the report. This was a survey that shows the existing communication infrastructure that agencies reported using. Some agencies reported using several communication technologies, some reported using none at all. But as you can see from this, the most common technology that people reported for both their vehicles and for their roadside infrastructure was cellular services. About 70% of agencies reported using 3G or 4G cell services to connect to their vehicles, and about 55% reported using 3G or 4G to connect to their roadside infrastructure, such as ARWIS. One thing to keep in mind is we asked about DSRC, and several agencies reported using DSRC, especially to communicate with their vehicles, with onboard units on the vehicles, communicating to DSRC RSUs stationed on the side of the road. However, at the time of this presentation, we received a recent FCC decision a couple weeks ago that takes away some of the bandwidth of 5G, reduces the channel width, which is going to significantly impact that technology. It's not 100% unusable as a result of that, but it's likely not the future of communication. Likely we'll need to explore 5G in the near future. Also, as Mark alluded to as well, agencies using older cellular equipment, especially those still using 3G cellular equipment, should be aware of the impending shutdown of 3G services by network providers as that bandwidth and spectrum gets reallocated to 4G and 5G. I believe AT&T is shutting that down February 2022. And as far as I know, Verizon is still proceeding with their plans to shut down 3G at the end of the year, unless something has changed very recently that I'm not aware of. So sort of tying into that, as we see 3G sort of starting to shut down and this move towards 4G and 5G cellular services, we wanted to take a look at which agencies were planning for 5G technology. And as we can see from this, it's relatively rare. Only about 25% of agencies reported that they are evaluating 5G connectivity, and most of these weren't any sort of pilot project. It was more sort of the, based on the survey results, it seemed more like initial inquiries into the technology. And as you can see, a large number of not sure answers there might indicate that agencies don't really see this as a realistic goal at this time, implementing 5G into their heavy maintenance vehicle fleet. We asked the question to rate interest in various winter maintenance technologies on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most interested in that technology and 1 being the least interested. And as you can see from this graph, you know, sort of those bars for agencies rating their interest as a 4 or 5 are a lot larger for technologies that are sort of well entrenched in the mainstream of winter maintenance, things like pavement sensors, storm severity index, NDSS, camera analytics, and so on. But some of the more emerging data analytics technologies, such as these big data platforms, machine learning, AI technology that Mark discussed, agencies don't show much interest in using those at this time, which indicates and hints at the fact that they are still in more of an experimental stage and not really able to be implemented in any sort of meaningful way beyond a test. So to sort of summarize the survey results, as we discussed, these emerging technologies are little interest to agencies, but we did identify several agencies reporting interesting use cases for these survey results, which we'll discuss in the follow-up interview section, which is coming up next. And again, cellular communication is a very common and very well-recommended method of communicating with especially vehicles, but roadside infrastructure as well. But research into 5G has not sort of caught up with the phase out of 3G in the very near future. There's also been talk of sort of a long-term phase out of 4G services, be more than a decade away. There's not been a planned date for that as far as I can tell, but it is something that's on the horizon, which means that 5G should be well entrenched before that becomes a reality. But the good news from the survey is that most agencies do use some sort of data to inform their winter maintenance operations, whether that's sensors on their plow vehicles, AVL GPS systems installed on their plows, crowdsourced weather data, traffic data, RWIS. Very few agencies are sort of in the dark ages, so to say, when it comes to technology, which was very good to see. So as a result of that survey, like we said, we provided several free-form responses so agencies can highlight some of their interesting projects, and we took some of those and we performed 5 follow-up interviews. We scheduled meetings with certain respondents and had a brief 30-minute, an hour conversation about what they reported in the survey. First up is the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Spoke with Randy Feltner and Jeremy Gould. The reason we selected them for a follow-up interview was they identified using big data platforms that they constructed in-house. They created a variety of different platforms that interconnect using Hadoop, Kibana Elastic, Kafka, several other platforms as well. This allowed them to produce dashboard visualizations, which can be very helpful when presenting data to the layman in a method that makes it easy to understand. They use this throughout their winter maintenance group to provide data both to the public and as well as to other individuals in the agencies, such as management. Right now, they only use it for winter maintenance. They don't use these platforms for anything beyond that, but they're very easily adaptable. And one thing that we were very encouraged to hear from the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet is they are very open to sharing these platforms that they've developed. They provided them to other agencies in the past. Other agencies haven't done much with them to their knowledge, but they're more than willing from the conversations we've had with them to share it with others and show how they can use big data to inform their winter maintenance decisions in the future. Our second follow-up interview was with the Idaho Transportation Department, Steve Spoor and Max Thiem. Hope I'm pronouncing that correct. The reason we selected them was they indicated that they were undergoing a pilot project with Vaisala's mobile RWIS system installed on their vehicles. This mobile RWIS system collects snow and ice thicknesses and pavement temperatures, which creates a thermal map that can be displayed to the operator in the vehicle, which helps the operator determine areas which might need more or less spreading material and helps them analyze for particular spreader mixes and so on. The operators have been highly praised of this system. They've indicated that it's really helped their operational efficiency because it lets them know which areas they need to focus on. But the Idaho Transportation Department is actually waiting for the next generation of devices from Vaisala before implementing this. They're looking for something that's a little cheaper, a little smaller, more easy to implement. But they've been very encouraged by the results of their pilot projects. Our third follow-up interview is with the Iowa Department of Transportation with Tina Greenfield Hewitt. They were selected because SAS Institute, the software company, makes statistical software, is testing their winter, testing SAS's winter road condition prediction system in Iowa using Iowa's data. Iowa DOT provides their traffic, weather, and plow AVL data to SAS, and they use this to generate predictions of future conditions. They're looking, I think they provide a 1 hour, 3 hour, and 6 hour prediction. The intent of this is provided to the 511 service in the future, but right now their system is only in a test mode. They haven't pushed anything to 511 yet. Iowa's described their success with this pilot project to date as okay. When they've received all the data they've needed and everything's gone smoothly, they've actually been able to make some very effective predictions, but there's some issues with the data formatting getting pushed to SaaS that were needed to be resolved in the early stages of the pilot project. And SaaS's system has also been having difficulty accounting for gaps in the data, meaning when an RWIS system is offline or for whatever reason they're not getting some sort of data, it's not able to effectively make a prediction and fill in that gap or estimate or anything like that. So communication being established to all of Iowa's data sources is critical for this to work. Our fourth follow-up interview was with the New York State Department of Transportation, Joe Thompson. We selected them for a follow-up interview because they indicated using a next generation maintenance decision support system, sort of the next stage evolution of the MDSS. This is a project that they're conducting with FHWA called Everyday Counts Weather Responsive Maintenance Systems. This MDSS uses pavement and air temperature from stationary RWISs, as well as vehicle sensors and crowdsourced traffic data. They use DSRC for their communication with OBUs on each vehicle, communicating this data to stationary RSUs installed on RWISs. They've had issues with this, with OBUs operating in low temperatures, but overall their system has generated improved accuracy and reliability over traditional NDSS. The operators have praised it because it requires less field verification of the results. New York State reported needing to field verify the results of their traditional MDSS far more often than they have with this new system. And the final follow-up interview we did was with the Norwegian Public Roads Administration. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Vegvesenet is the Norwegian name for the bureau. And that interview was conducted with Kai Rune Lisbakken. We selected them because they, similar to Idaho, they have a pilot project with Vaisala, this time for their road AI equipment. And one other thing that was very interesting from their survey results was they reported that an airport operator, Avinor, was implementing an automated runway sweeper test. So that was sort of one of the only indications of any research into automated vehicles being done in the winter maintenance field that we found. The Vaisala road AI system that they're testing uses on-plow cameras to determine the road surface conditions and pavement marking quality. The intent of the system is to develop machine learning procedures for winter road maintenance recommendations, so they can take the data from the cameras and evaluate it that way. Right now, they've only sort of done qualitative analysis with it using the cameras. They haven't gotten too far into the weeds of the machine learning applications of the road AI system. Again, they're currently operating in a test mode, but they're looking at developing a list of use cases to figure out how they can use this to better serve their winter maintenance needs in a more automated way. Regarding the runway sweeping that they reported, again, it's being connected by Avinor, which is a Norwegian airport operator. They had tested it in a very small, remote, rural airport and have since moved it over to the airport in Oslo. But this is still a very new technology in its infancy. Results have been very encouraging from their tests, but nothing that is ready for a widespread deployment at this time. So to kind of tie this back into some of the data analytics tools that were reported by Kentucky, we did a summary, an overview of several data analytics and big data packages on the market right now to generate a list of recommendations and sort of the current state of the practice of this field. So I will turn it back over to Mark to discuss this.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone, again. So one of the things that really struck us was this notion of big data. And I keep putting it in quotes because it's a jargony term that gets thrown around a lot. And it is one of the things that is emerging that changes the underlying tools and workflows that we're seeing out there. And it's a little unusual in that regard. So we decided to take a little bit closer look at that as an adjunct task to the research we were doing here. So the big question is, why is this its own section? And the short answer is it's important. These technologies can produce better answers, and they can produce faster answers than traditional database analysis tools. But the terms are ambiguous, and the terms cover many technologies. Typically, whenever you start talking about big data, the first question is, well, what's that? Is that a database? Is it a stat analysis tool? Is it a visualization tool? What is that? Well, the short answer is it's a lot of things. And we went through an exercise at SRF over, well, really almost the last 2 years to start looking at and implementing these big data platforms or these stacks of technology. And there is a lot of decision making that goes into choosing these tools. And there's a lot of decision making because there are so many options. Options about how you deploy them, options about how you develop your solutions, options about who and how they get used, and how they get maintained. We're also finding that these things are rapidly evolving, they're rapidly maturing and becoming usable, and they are very rapidly being replaced by newer technologies. So even though the underlying functions are the same, the tools, the mechanisms that one uses to do these things changes quick. And we've actually seen that just within our own operation here at SRF. We started out with a lot of Apache tools early on and ended up abandoning a lot of that and going to other systems. So what I'd like to do here is just give you a quick overview of what this stack is, a quick view into some of the decisions you have to make, and then really encourage you to go and take a look at the section in the report that covers this, because there's just far too many options and bits of information to cover here. Next slide, please. So there are, as I mentioned, a lot of pieces and parts that goes into a data analytics or a big data deployment. You of course have all of your data sources on the left there, things like your AVL data, all your ops data from MDSS or other record keeping, all of your roadway input data, all of your traffic sensor data. That goes into a data pipeline. And in that pipeline is where all of these different options, all of these different tools live. You begin by doing what the data science people like to call data wrangling, which is really just organizing, rationalizing, and cleaning all of those data sources and moving them into some sort of data warehouse. And that's not a new term. We've been talking about data warehouses at least since the 1980s, but the structure and mechanisms of that data warehousing has really changed, and your options have really changed, and that's important to realize. From there, the tools to extract it, analyze it, visualize it, take that data and make it into information, that's the output of that pipeline. So there's nothing fundamentally new here for folks. I'm sure you've all seen things like this before, but it's important to keep that structure in your head as you start to look at some of the options. So let's look at an example. Next slide, please. One of the first questions is, do you build your own? Similar to what KYTC did, or do you hire somebody to do that? We've put together, and this is in the report, a quick SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunity, threat sort of diagram. And there are a number of different pieces within each of these. But fundamentally, when you look at, do I build it versus do I buy it? With an in-house solution, you own the system. You can build fast, you can adapt fast, assuming that you have the skilled staff that you need, that those staff are available, and that you don't have internal technical limitations, either within your agency or within an overall IT structure. When you outsource things, you can start quickly as well, because you can just go straight to expert developers and say, I need a widget that does X. But those experts coming from outside may not have domain expertise. They may not be the subject matter experts you need, and you're subject to the business decisions of that vendor. And perhaps more importantly, you're subject to their price structure. Here's an interesting lesson we learned working with some connected vehicle data. It was, gosh, I want to say about 1 trillion records, something like that. And it was packed into, I want to say maybe 10 terabytes or something like that of data. So not a gigantic data set, but substantial, and a bigger data set than our IT group wanted on our corporate storage servers. So we went, I want to say it was to Amazon AWS to store our data out there for analysis. Where the business structure comes in is Amazon makes it very, very cheap to put data on their system, but very expensive to pull it back off. And the reason is obvious. They want to discourage you from migrating back to your own servers or to somebody who can store it cheaper. So when you think about in-house versus outsourcing, those are the kinds of discussions you need to have. The other piece of it is, next slide, please. Basically, who does what within all of this. And these are all of the as a service things that you keep hearing about. Software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. So in our report, we have a little diagram that talks about that as well. When you bring things on premises and you have your agency or a broader IT group manage it, you control everything from the physical hardware on up. That gives you a lot of flexibility, a lot of capability to choose the best solution. But you now are responsible for managing all of that, and perhaps even more important, you're responsible for paying for all of that. You can move into something called infrastructure as a service, where somebody else provides the physical bits for it, and you just install and run operating system hardware, data, stuff like that. You can go farther and say that I want to have my platform. In other words, somebody else is responsible basically for providing you with Windows servers or Red Hat servers, and you install your application data on that. You can also have somebody give you the whole thing. I want all of my applications provided for me. I want you to manage all of my data. I want you to provide all of the infrastructure for it to run on. Understanding those differences and thinking about the trade-offs that you have with each of them is important for making a decision on what you're going to deploy. I wish we could delve deeply into this, but we could easily do an hour and a half just on this section in the report. So again, I really encourage everybody to spend a few minutes looking at that. It's got lots of neat graphics, lots of lists of actual real life solutions and providers, things like that, and lots of discussions of the differences between them. So please take a look at that, because we've just scratched the surface on some of the decisions you have to make. Next slide, please. So what is it actually being used for? Well, what we're seeing is it's being applied to more or less the same questions, but it's providing better, more complete, or quicker answers. The usual suspects like route optimization, where's the best stationing for my vehicles? What's the best route for them to take based on various conditions? Iowa DOT and others have been working on that for quite a while. Performance modeling based upon atmospheric conditions and precipitation. How do speeds change? Where do they change? And what is the relationship of roadway geometry, number of lanes, curvature, things like that? How do all of those things affect the performance of the roadway? The Japanese have pushed forward with that. And as Chris noted earlier, data visualization and exploration is a big part of this. Just giving people the tools to dig into this and find their own answers is a very, very powerful thing. And that's what the folks in Kentucky have been doing. Next slide, please. So finally, taking away from this brief discussion, number one, again, there's lots of information in what we put together there. I actually had a PhD data scientist on our staff go through and create a lot of that content. His bread and butter is working with these tools. So again, please take a look. There's lots of good information in there. But from a managerial standpoint, bear in mind that the tools and the techniques to do these things change fast. And we've seen that just within our own organization. So don't be afraid to experiment, and more importantly, don't be afraid to change directions. Manage your commitments, both in terms of skill development and finance, so that you're able to sample things and move in different directions if that needs. Also, bear in mind that there are a lot of different skill sets needed. What we've seen be effective is looking outside of just an agency, beyond an operations group, beyond a maintenance group, into a larger Department of Transportation, and beyond that, into other state or other agencies, even at the university level. Look for those skills and leverage the resources that you have available to you. And the last one is important. Know what you want to know. Be able to describe what in jargony terms is the KPIs, the key performance indicators. What is it you want to get out of this? Because that is going to affect your design decisions. It's going to affect the commitments you make. So if you have an idea, not even in terms of a number, but just qualitatively, what do I need to know about my roadway? What do I need to know about my operations? Being able to articulate that clearly will help a lot as you start to make decisions about deploying these data analysis tools. With that, I'll give it back to Chris.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. So, kind of as we touched on at the beginning of the report, all of the information we gathered over the previous task, which we presented on, has been sort of consolidated into a set of recommendations for each group of technologies. These recommendations are both for initial deployments that could happen today, and also on that 5-year horizon, we discussed the future and areas for pilot projects and what the state of that technology might look like over that short-term future. Mobile sensor systems, sensors on vehicles to detect items like pavement, temperature, etc. It's very important to assess the communication coverage in your service area to gauge viability of communications with mobile on-vehicle sensors. This means that in rural areas where 4G coverage might not be as prevalent right now as in more urban areas, it may not be as effective to put mobile sensors on vehicles because you'd have difficulty getting them back to your central site. Mark touched on some other alternatives under research right now with pilot deployments, such as the low power wide area network. But right now, cellular is the most feasible system for vehicle communications to get this data back. So keep that in mind with cost considerations as well. The biggest prohibiting factor to a large widespread deployment of mobile sensors is cost considerations. This is while the cost is going down over the past few years and expected to continue to go down, still a very expensive system to implement. So right now our recommendation would be to limit deployments onto key plow vehicles on key routes, supervisor vehicles maybe, particularly identifying routes where data along the entire route is most useful, routes where getting point data from a stationary RWIS may not be suitable for a mobile sensor deployment. Over the longer term, though, kind of like we touched on, costs of these systems may drop, so we can identify products coming out that might be more cost effective in this area. It's also important to, and this is sort of a theme throughout both what Mark was touching on the big data platforms and also some of the other recommendations that we'll get into. Before doing any sort of deployment, it's important to ensure that you're identifying effective, very specific use cases before deployment. There's no sense in rolling out a system, making a huge monetary investment if you don't know exactly what you want from that system. Driver assistance systems, this is mainly discussing camera systems on vehicles. What we found from our research is that vehicle reversing cameras and cameras that monitor tow plows are very effective, and operators have commented that it really helps with their spatial awareness around the vehicle and helps improve operator safety. Camera systems are reported to be less useful for monitoring wing plow operations, This is because they have difficulty providing visual confirmation in time to avoid a collision. So not as effective from a safety standpoint. When deploying these camera systems, we recommend going with a pilot deployment for one maintenance season prior to a widespread deployment. Again, this is primarily for cost considerations. Make sure it works for your agencies. Some agencies reported that their drivers didn't like having camera systems because it's distracting from their operations, distracting their vision away from the road. But many agencies did find these very helpful, so it's important to make sure before making a significant investment that it works for your agency. Other technologies such as collision warning and lane guidance, Mark kind of touched on this earlier, but there's no products right now for those that are commercially available out on the market. But you know, outside of deployments on a pilot status, on a test status, we're not really anticipating anything like that in the next 3 to 5 years. But it's important to, keep in touch with vehicle suppliers to identify new products as they become available, to look into these pilot tests. With connected and autonomous vehicle systems, again, this is a technology that's emerging and would only be deployed in a pilot state at this time. Kind of going back to what we talked about before, we want to make sure that there's specific use cases and expected outcomes before engaging in any sort of deployment. And it's also very important to demonstrate full integration of all your components, any sort of roadside unit or onboard unit, software, signal controllers if you're interfacing with the signal system in the area, before actually putting it out in the field on a widespread basis. Again, this is something that's way easier to test on the bench rather than out in the field once it's been deployed, and cost considerations come into play as well. Video analytics. Before implementing a video analytics system, recommend identifying if your existing video surveillance capabilities can effectively complement your RWIS, meaning if these cameras if a video analytics system that you deploy would be compatible with your existing camera system, and if your existing CCTVs, whether that's stationary or vehicle mounted, if it's going to provide you with enough accurate and important usable data before making an investment into this sort of system. Should research available commercially available weather-related video analytics packages. This is because each vendor of these packages really focuses on different use cases. So it's important to sort of go through and pick out what vendor might be best for you. There's also price considerations that come into play. Some require a certain number of cameras, licensing considerations, and so on. But where implemented, video analytics have been found to be effective in assisting the operators to make more informed decisions in their winter maintenance activities. Communication systems, we've sort of touched on this a few times over the presentation, but over the very short term, 3G will getting phased out, and there's very long term, over a decade, to phasing out 4G. Because of this, I think it's important for all agencies to pursue 5G and conduct pilot projects where possible. Sort of, kind of like Mark alluded to, we've sort of seen this. 5G is now readily available on the consumer side for consumer cellular, but as we look into this local area network applications of 5G, we're sort of still in a pilot state at this time. Even though the DSRC has had part of its spectrum revoked by the recent FCC decision, we do still recommend pursuing pilot projects involving DSRC. That removal of the spectrum is going to significantly impact the speed and viability of the data being transmitted over DSRC. But because 5G is still in the test state right now, we don't really know for sure if it's the answer for winter maintenance right now. So continuing pursuing DSRC provides a sort of a fallback plan for that if 5G doesn't really work out the way we think it will. This push towards cellular is, again, because of cost considerations. Because of this, hardwire communication to stationary devices should be generally avoided, except for those that might already be on your, for example, your local signal fiber optic network. It might make sense to incorporate a stationary RWIS into that, but it's not cost effective to go out of your way to connect a remote RWIS via fiber. And again, keep monitoring availability of newer satellite-based systems for remote locations. As the new technology develops, it's worthwhile to test out the pilot capability as an alternative to cellular. Crowdsourced traffic and weather data. It's been reported to be useful and a very useful complement to data obtained by agencies. And this is something we haven't touched much on over the course of the presentation, but this has been traffic data such as INRIX and Waze, and some of the crowdsourced weather data platforms out there as well. It's very important to understand the limitations of these data sources because their crowdsourced data might not be as valid as data coming from, say, National Weather Service. And also these private crowdsourced data, especially the traffic data companies such as INRIX, might have contractual restrictions on the retention, use, or distribution of data, which we've had a few individuals report that running into those issues when using crowdsourced data, especially as they expand into larger, more complex projects that utilize that data. Crowdsourced weather data, kind of like I touched on before, typically should only be used as a supplement to primary weather data sources as a confirmation or confirmation of those data sources. And this is because those primary weather data sources, such as National Weather Service, are so much more available than any sort of primary traffic data, typically Google and Waze and so on, and the ways to go for that sort of data. MDSS systems, and then the enhanced and next generation MDSS. MDSSs have been found to be highly effective for all agencies that use them have reported having great improvements in efficiency. Operators have praised them to be able to better provide responses to storm events. Also useful for post-event analysis to help improve in the future. So because of that, agencies without a current MDSS are highly recommended to implement one, even with some of the infrastructure costs that might entail. These sort of enhanced and next generation MDSS systems continue to evolve alongside connected vehicle technology. And because of this, still, again, like most emerging technologies, this is still in a pilot state. So we recommend pursuing pilot projects with enhanced and next generation MDSS as they come up, sort of like we observed in New York State. These enhanced and next generation MDSS systems in the near future might follow that Kentucky model that KYTC uses with several big data platforms processing the data to help enhance the data analysis. Big data platform, again, where implemented, this has been proven to be very effective, and sort of like we've touched on several times before, it's very worthwhile to reach out to KYTC and see about get the specifics of their data platform, see if it would be usable for your agency. When pursuing these big data platforms, in-house development might be preferable to outside development in a lot of cases if you have that infrastructure and staffing level and level of commitment within your own agency, because you get to develop software for your particular use cases rather than respond to market forces. Visualization and dashboard tools. Again, there's several tools out there on the market, ArcGIS, Tableau, all which have their pros and cons, so it's important to establish which visualization tools are most appropriate for your agency, which use cases you need, what exactly you want to get out of your dashboard tools. And some of these proprietary tools do come with significant cost considerations. due to the power that they provide. And many agencies already have a significant investment into Esri products in other areas. Because of this, ArcGIS Online is recommended for those agencies as the visualization tool of choice. So to sort of wrap everything up, we come to the end here. Again, we've conducted an exhaustive research project that included a literature review, survey, follow-up interviews, and the data analytics tool summary that we then synthesized into the recommendations that were just presented. And what we found is, while there is activity across all knowledge domains, incremental changes being made everywhere, incremental improvements, but there's not that one big technology that's ready to go right now that's going to change the world of winter maintenance. We're seeing a lot of incremental evolutionary technology, but there are opportunities for evaluation and experimental deployments, especially with regards to 5G and then some of these big data platforms. So with that, I think we'll bring it to an end. So thank you, and I think we can open it up to questions now.
All right, well, thank you guys. I'm looking in the chat box and I don't see any questions or comments right now, but if anybody does have any, certainly you can enter in the chat box, or I believe you could probably even just unmute your own line and ask a question. And also, if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to the research team as you see their contact information up there. Or if in the interim, until we get this posted, you don't see, you don't have their access to their emails, you can certainly send it to me and I can forward it to them and get you any answers that you might need. So since I'm not seeing any questions rolling right now, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you for the research team for your conducting this project, and just thank you and have a great rest of your week.